When I thought about a title for my presentation, I wanted something that not only resonated with the audience, but also kind of like spoke about my experience as an active practitioner, right? So I came up with rethinking your cybersecurity strategy, more solutions, less technology, which in this case, I'm going to be talking specifically about data protection, but you're going to find that towards the end of my presentation, that really this topic is applicable to other areas within the cyberspace. So this is applicable, for example, for endpoint and or system security. This is also applicable for network security, for risk and compliance, and other areas, right? Three things that I want to note is that this presentation will be one, vendor agnostic, two, it will be industry agnostic, and three, it will also be geo agnostic, which means that regardless if you're in Canada, if you're in the US, if you're in Latin America, then this will be valuable information for you guys. And it's stuff that is happening out there, right? Because a lot of this information is based on my personal experience. So it might be applicable for you guys, right? Anyways, the agenda for today is I'm going to be asking the $1 million question. Why do data breaches matter? Talk about some recent trends that I've found out there, some of the customer challenges, dive a little bit deeper into data loss prevention, and also talk about solutions, right? Which is basically the core of the subject. And then finally, some Q&As. So $1 million question, why do data breaches matter, right? Due to the nature of data breaches, what we found is that right now we have lack of specialized people like human resources, processes, and technologies. So even though in theory we keep saying, people, process, technology, in practice, what we're doing is actually the inverse. So we're really starting, and what I'm finding out there when I'm engaged with different organizations, is that they typically start with implementing the technology, and then they worry about their DLP program, or they worry about the data governance as a whole. So more so now with this pandemic, and echoing a little bit of what Jason mentioned with his presentation, is that now organizations are trying to kind of like run before they've learned how to crawl or walk in terms of implementing technologies, right? I had a customer that they were like 80% of their endpoints were desktops, right? So they had to, once COVID hit, they had to run and buy like a whole bunch of laptops, right, to be able to cover their workforce. And not only that, but they also had to spend a lot of money with licensing on endpoint security. So starting from VPNs, starting with data loss prevention. But as if some of you guys have worked with data loss prevention, implementing data loss prevention technologies and or programs, you know that data loss prevention is not something that you're going to implement in a day or in hours. I mean, it's something that may take weeks, months, even years, right? To get that program solid, working as it should, and obviously getting that technology tuned to the optimal level. So also we find that data breaches, right, happen, and organizations are really finding out what data has left the organization after the fact, right? So if there's a data breach, it's very hard right now to determine or pinpoint what has happened, right? You end up finding out months later, weeks later after the fact. And up until that point in time, that's where they typically call me, right? Leo, can you please come and help us out? Can you please check and see what happened? And data has already been stolen, right? So I'm gonna talk about this a little bit deeper later on, but also, as data breaches occur, then obviously there is impact, and that impact is reflected more so on organizations that have to meet regulatory compliances or requirement, because they are subject to regulatory fines. They are subject to class lawsuits. There is obviously loss of business due to damaged reputation, right? That is one of the main things. I mean, if a bank is attacked or it's breached, then obviously, the first thing that you want to do if you have a bank account there, you're probably will want to move your bank account from that bank to the competitor. And obviously, there's loss of productivity. Remember that when we were talking about data loss prevention, we need to focus on the CIA of the data, right? So basically, the availability, confidentiality, and integrity of the data. So once there is a breach, then we lose that, because obviously we start looking into how much time it takes for us to recover the data, how much time it takes for people to be able to recover databases, and so on, the services, applications, so on and so forth, right? So what are the some of the recent trends that I've found out there? I found that 3 recent trends are negatively impacting the fight against data breaches. We have remote users. Some of these actually have been fueled by COVID or have been enhanced by COVID. So we have remote users because obviously they may handle sensitive data outside the organization. Then we have BYOD, which is a big one. I find out that a lot of organizations right now are running to move to a cloud, right? But obviously with that, there's a lot that comes with it, right? Obviously, you have to think about policies, you have to think about processes, you have to think about procedures, you have to think about training. And obviously, if you already have a data loss prevention or a DLP program in place, then that needs to be updated, that needs to be maintained to fit the changes that are occurring in the overall spectrum or cyberspace. So BYOD is one of the biggest things right now. A lot of organizations are trying to leverage their own employees' personal devices so that they can, work and enable them to work. But we don't know what level of security those devices have. We don't know if those devices, what operating systems they are, right? Some people might be using a Linux. Some people, might be using a Kali Linux to do their, regular job, right? That's a possibility. So what can you do, or how can you ensure that these devices are secure and that the data, because eventually they're going to need to be able to access data within the corporate environment. So how can you make sure that these people or these employees are accessing data in a safe way, right? And finally, the constant, which is obviously cyber criminals, which is something that typically organizations are, I can say that 12 years ago, this was the only focus, cyber criminals, right? But as time is progressing and as the cyberspace is changing, requirements are changing, and at the same time, we are seeing that attacks are being are more complex. We are now seeing a lot of ransomware attacks. We're now seeing a lot of fileless attacks that are occurring on different organizations, where 12 years ago, we were seeing that attackers, they just wanted to, destroy your operating system or your applications. They wanted to corrupt your operating system. But the focus back then wasn't really the data. Nowadays, the focus is the data, because now cyber criminals they know that there could be a compensation attached to that, right? So if they steal data, they can sell that data in the deep web. They can do a lot of stuff with that information. They can sell it to the competitor. And so there is a financial aspect to it now, right? Also, now that with the pandemic and all, we are also seeing a lot of insider threats, which are basically the same employees. And at the same time, we're seeing that organizations are more concerned also with contractors, third party. Also remember that one of the things that is largely impacting the world right now is the fact that we're losing jobs, right? Because of the pandemic. So obviously people are trying to make ends meet, and they will want to attack to grab information, sell it, and get their financial aspect of things, right? What are some of the customer challenges that I've found? I found that nowadays, obviously, organizations are now using larger data volumes. So it means that now you have to come up with, tools or technologies that are able to protect these large data volumes. 10 years back, even 15 years ago, we really weren't talking about, exabytes or terabytes of data, right? Because organizations weren't as big as they are right now. Now we're talking about massive file servers and storage pools of data that we now have to worry about and secure, especially when organizations need to withhold that data for a specific amount of time because of compliance purposes. Also, one of the challenges, like I mentioned before, is the DLP programs. Data governance is usually an afterthought. Organizations typically start with DLP technologies, and then they go back to processes, and then they start thinking about hiring people. One of the things that I found, actually, I have one example with one of my customers recently, is that they wanted to buy a data loss prevention technology, right? So because they were enabling more people to work from home, but at the same time, there's a lot that comes with the technology. You have to train people because they need to be trained on how they have to classify the data. They need to be trained on, you have to classify this file as confidential. You have to classify this file as public. You have to classify this file as, I don't know, sensitive or whatnot, or, depending on the different classification schemas that you've come up with. But you have to train users on that. And at the same time, you have to train users on the use of the tool, right? So obviously you can't run right now and think that the technology, DLP technology, is a silver bullet, because it's really not, right? So that's one of the main challenges that I've found. Also, there's a lack of processes around data protection. Sometimes I find that, there are vulnerabilities tied to, whatchamacallit, the processes, because people are just not following the processes, right? Or because the processes are out of date, so they're no longer applicable to today's world or today's reality. Lack of security professionals, that is a constant. But not only that, I would link that point with the next one, which is security professionals are technology experts and not security experts. I find a lot that in organizations, there are a lot of security analysts, right? But the security analysts really, they're just focusing on a specific technology, right? But if you start asking them about data classification, you ask them about, digital rights management, you start asking them about firewalls, you start asking them about incident response, about, SIM technologies, other areas within the cyberspace, they just don't understand these other areas, or they decide to turn a blind eye because it's just not their area, right? So we need to slowly start moving away from being technology experts and really be security experts. We need to know, what else touches data loss prevention, because data loss prevention is just one aspect of things, but there are multiple other areas that basically impact or are dependencies for a data loss prevention program. There's also lack of expertise on implemented technologies. I've been there, engaged multiple projects here in Canada and all over North America, Latin America, same thing. You go there and you find that the technologies are half-baked, right? They're not using the full features and functionalities of the technologies, and which actually that ties into, the limited scope of DLP, that point there. I'm finding out that, DLP, usually technology have different features, right? But some organizations, they just limit the scope of DLP to the compliance requirements. So if it's PCI, then I'm just going to create rules and policies, processes, and procedures based on PCI, and that's it. But when you start asking questions about other information or data that might be sensitive, then they don't have anything planned around that. So sometimes I talk about, let's say, or ask questions around, network diagrams, marketing campaigns, could be legal documents, could be IP, intellectual property, could be some other aspects outside of, PCI, outside of HIPAA, PIPEDA, or GDPR, and organizations, they don't have these rules or policies or procedures in place, or the technology is not even configured to track all these other aspects, right? And I guess to a certain extent, this ties into the point there that says that DLP is just a checkbox for compliancy purposes. So a lot of organizations, they just want to meet that audit checkbox, so they have the technology there, but then again, it doesn't push, the organization to take DLP to that the next level, right? And then finally, I see that there's millions of events and incidents being generated by these tools, where it's practically impossible for the admins or the analysts to be able to track data. So even if you have a tool there, right, if you don't have the tool fine-tuned, then you end up having event floods, or it's just simply impossible to track or analyze, right? So you end up analyzing information, and since you have millions of events, I have customers that only have one person looking after their whole DLP technology, right? So it's really very hard and difficult for one person to analyze and track, these incidents and events. Typically, DLP technologies can provide with all these different levels of protection, right? You have data protection, which basically tracks and analyzes data in use and data in motion. So basically all the flows of data as you send an email outside, you web post a file, or you screen capture, that is typically covered by data protection, right? Then the DLP technologies also do device control, which is basically controlling external drives or flash drives or whatnot, Bluetooth devices. Some do discovery, to be able to find information or find sensitive data either in file servers, databases, cloud services, or endpoints, behavior analytics, and file integrity monitoring, right? So typically, these are kind of like the main points that a DLP technology out there, regardless of the vendor, right? Because some vendors, they might do only one of these, another vendor might do all of these, or another vendor might do like a combination of all these different aspects, right? But these technologies, they cover these egress points. So data that is being sent through email, web, external drives, removable storage, cloud drives. So for example, if you have a local OneDrive, or you have a G drive or whatnot, locally, a Dropbox, data that is sent there, screen captures, clipboards, printing, among others, right? But what happens when you start asking these questions, right? What happens when sensitive data is created in the cloud? What happens when sensitive data is shared from or to the cloud? What happens when sensitive data leaves the organization? What happens when the data is found on a file server, a database, and or a cloud service? What happens when the data is found on a non-approved user's machine? Or what happens when a sensitive data is manipulated? Or when the sensitive data is transferred to a non-secure device outside of the organization? So you start asking all these questions, which basically, to be able to respond to these questions in terms of technical controls, then you start thinking about data protection technologies, other data protection technologies. So note this, when I started my presentation, I didn't really add there data rethinking, cybersecurity strategy, data loss prevention. It said data protection, because data protection typically includes a lot of other elements, out of which data loss prevention is just one of those elements. So you're seeing here that to answer those questions, you start thinking about other technologies such as data classification, digital rights management, file and folder encryption, drive encryption, file integrity monitoring, CASB, database activity monitoring, among others, right? So then you start making this like a huge web of different technologies that the organizations end up requiring to be able to answer those questions and to obviously better secure their environment. But the main issue here is that as we are right now, that we have technology experts, then we end up having or acquiring or acquiring what we can call siloed technologies. So we have one technology for data classification, one technology for DRM, one technology for encrypted drives. And since people are segregated completely in their roles and they are turning a blind eye, then it makes it a little bit more difficult to be able to correlate data between these different technologies. So this is where the data protection solutions come into play. This is the meat of my presentation. So basically solutions, when we talk about solutions, we're basically referring to integration. So what we need to be looking into right now is to try and integrate these technologies as much as we can, right? So here, for example, I created 4 different like solution packages, if you will, where solution A includes 3 different technologies that I know for a fact that can be integrated between the 3, right? Regardless of the vendor, right? So you can integrate, for example, a data loss prevention product from vendor A with a data classification product or technology from vendor B, and with a digital rights management product from vendor C. And then you can add to that stack other components that you know for a fact can work together well and can give you guys added value in terms of your overall data protection solution. So this is what we found, or what I've found, that is beneficial for organizations. Why? Because obviously you now have technologies that work well together instead of having silos, and at the same time you have a lot of benefits that come with it, which I'm going to get into in just a few minutes. One of the things that I want to share here is that I had a customer, for example, that they acquired a discovery tool to be able to scan file servers and databases and whatnot for sensitive data from vendor A, right? But then they acquired a data loss prevention software or technology from vendor B. Turns out that vendor A and vendor B didn't play well together. So what happened next was that, they ran discovery scans, they classified the data, but at the end of the day, they didn't have the ability to be able to action or to react to that data that was classified because the 2 tools weren't able to communicate with each other. So they ended up scratching vendor A and acquiring a secondary discovery tool from that vendor B so that they were able to do data loss prevention, right? And at the same time do discovery. So obviously that added some costs, right? That was an extra expense. Not only that, but they lost implementation time. They lost time with architecting, designing, and implementing the first solution, the first product, and also training, right? So this is where you kind of like have to start making that switch over from focusing on just one technology for that checkbox to actually building a solid solution, right? So an example of this could be that for discovery you can leverage DLP and CASB, right? DLP can do a discovery scan on a file server on a database, and you can use CASB to run a discovery scan on your cloud environment, either if that's Office 365, if it's AWS, if it's Google. And then you can identify using a data classification technology, right? And then you can protect that data once you identify that the data is classified as, or should be classified as, confidential. You can protect that data by either encrypting the file, right? Or by adding digital rights management to be able to track that data once it leaves the organization. Because one of the main things here is that, yes, we implement DLP technologies, and you're tracking whatever is set or configured to leave the environment. But once it leaves the environment, you don't know if the data, what happens with the data. You don't know if the data has been manipulated. You don't know if the data has been reshared accidentally or maliciously. You just lose track of things, right? And then finally, you can analyze all of this in one single pane of glass, which would be your SIM solution, right? So then at the end of the day, this becomes a data-centric solution where you have multiple technologies working as one single pane of glass, basically. So why is it important? What are the benefits? Like I mentioned before, you save costs and training because really some of these technologies from these vendors have the capabilities or the abilities to fully integrate. And when I'm talking about integration, typically what happens is that vendor A has the ability to talk to the database of vendor B, and then you're able to correlate information that way. But there are some vendors and some integrations out there that you can fully manage and integrate technologies within one single management console. So there, you will be saving costs and training because, if your people have already trained in that single, management console, then it's easy for them to continue using that same console for deploying data protection products. Added value from technologies, obviously, via this way, you make sure that you're using all of the maximum amount of features from all these technologies. You get added security because now it's a data-centric approach, not a technology approach or not just a DLP approach. You get better reporting because you now get the whole picture. You now get the picture about data classification. You get the picture of data loss prevention, DRM, encryption. You get the full picture of what's happening in the environment. Therefore, you get better incident response because now you have less false positives. And then finally, you end up focusing on security and not necessarily on technology, because people, once you have a data-centric approach, then people or even the analysts or whoever are now going to be have to be focused or trained to manage all of these different technologies. So now they're going to learn about data classification, DRM, and encryption, drive encryption, file encryption, all of these different aspects, right? So ultimately, and just to close off, you can better answer these questions, right? You can better answer the who, who can access the data, what rights do they have, when can they do it, and finally, where can they do it, right? So to finish off, reiterate that people, process, and technology, that's the flow. And in that order, that's how we should be looking into things. So let's start thinking less about technologies and being technology experts, and let's start thinking about being security experts and start thinking about building solutions for our environment. With that, I want to thank you guys. Here's our contact information. Just to note that Calian, we have different vendors and that we've partnered up with in terms of data protection. So check out our website and feel free to reach out if you have any doubts, questions, or if you want to have just a friendly conversation. Thank you.